the interest of time, I think we might kick start. Once again, really warm welcome to everybody. My name's Peta Ashworth. I'm the Director of the Institute for Energy Transition. And as you know, we run these webinars from time to time fairly consistently to try and think about some of the challenges for energy transition. So we're very fortunate today to be joined by Manik Mahajan, and also Sharan Burrow is on her way, but she's meeting with the Minister and might be a few minutes late, so expect her to appear. And I just feel very privileged that we've got Manik to share his insights today. Before we kickstart though, I would like to take a moment to respectfully acknowledge the Whadjuk elders, past and present, as the traditional owners of where Curtin is located, and just acknowledge their contribution, knowledge-wise, culture, and also the insights into how we live sustainably and care for our country. And obviously the role that they are playing and the potential role that they can play in this transition. I know Manik's going to touch on that. This webinar also comes off the back of a finance workshop that Manik actually joined us in last November, and we were very fortunate to have a range of, I think, great thinkers, project developers, financiers, to just really sit and think about this issue and try and surface some of the issues. So I'm really pleased that we can have this webinar to build on that, because as much as, you know, there's lots of models and we've done it all before, it just seems to be, to me, one of the things that how do we unlock this? And so I'm really excited to see Manik's presentation, hear the discussion as we go through. Just briefly, Manik Mahajan is a principal and co-lead of Australia at Arthur D. Little, a trusted advisor to executives and boards across APAC on investment and capital issues around the energy transition and infrastructure. I probably don't need to, Sharan, you've known because she's the chair of our advisory board, but she's a global advocate for human rights, climate action and just transition, and former General Secretary of the International Trade Union Confederation, and many years ago was also President of Australian Council of Trade Unions. So I think when Sharan joins, I mean, her knowledge of finance and the transition will just complement exactly what Manik is saying. So I think as we've done the last ones, Manik's going to present for about 20 minutes and then we'll open up the Q&A. Obviously, it's if you've got questions, put them through there and we'll try and moderate a discussion. And as I said, Sharan might join. So Manik, I might hand over to you to start your presentation, and thanks again for joining.
Thank you, Peta, for that incredible introduction, and pleasure to be here. Looking in the chat, I see a lot of familiar names, so pleasure to see some familiar names, and also to meet and talk to very many interested colleagues here today. I'll try and keep this short, and hopefully we can spend more time on Q&A and answer the questions people actually have rather than what I have to say or what Sharan has to say. Before I get into it, just checking my screen is visible to everyone. Peta, is the screen working fine for yourself? I might have lost Peta there for a second. Hi, Peta.
I don't know what happened then, but did I
Well, you're
drop
back
out?
now, and I can hear and see you.
Right. So are you presenting, or did the whole thing close?
I'm about to start, and I was just waiting a second for
Oh,
yourself.
apologies. I don't know. It must have been my computer. Sorry.
Perfectly okay. IT is the best, not the best of us on a good day. Well, firstly, ADL, it's a really good pleasure to be part of what is the world's oldest management consulting firm. Here in Australia, we are focused on the energy transition, and we really do three things quite simply. We raise money, we deploy money, and we structure money. So ADL globally is a leading advisor on many topics in Australia as a product of my background and the background of people like Oliver Yates and a few other colleagues that are part of the team. We are much more focused on finance and using the levers available to us in finance in order to unlock the investments required in very tough to invest and important to invest industries. And to start today, I wanted to start with a thought, which was if today we wanted to build the Northwest Shelf, we probably wouldn't. And that's really what I wanted to spend a bit of time today going through is how to think about financing similarly large and complex opportunities in green iron and critical minerals and many other opportunities that are ahead of us. Because the era that made possible investing in nation-leading and nation-building projects like the Northwest Shelf as part of a commodity super cycle and iron ore super cycle have formed the keystones of our current economy through which we're able to live high qualities of life and afford good healthcare, good education, good welfare services. And the important thing I often find myself reminding myself and people we work with is Australia doesn't exist in a vacuum. And we do need to be creative to think about these complex investments because if we don't, the world is large and money is lazy. It does tend to go towards where it can. And Australia might not be the only place that is in contention for the capital markets and where they're looking to place the money. So before we get into it, I suppose to belabor that point a bit more, $34 billion. It's the anchor to everything I'm going to talk about today. That was the number that was taken in today's dollars. Some of the colleagues in the chat today, I see, know this number better than I do. That it took to build Northwest Shelf in a set of conditions that don't really exist in the same way today. And we'll talk a bit more about that in a second. But the deeper point around that is we shouldn't assume that industries like iron ore are going to have volumes that are going to continue to be able to do the heavy lifting for our economy in the way they have in the last 20 years. And lower iron ore content, new supply from countries like Simandou, Brazil, and the pricing in China all eat away from the margins that have carried us over the last 20, 25 years. So given how central iron is to who we've become economically, the task in front of us is to think about how to capture these new values that the resource base that we have at our disposal is asking for, and how to put regions like the Pilbara on a new footing to move away from shipping the ore to doing that and other things. And I suppose with that in mind, when we talk about what actually made the Northwest Shelf bankable, so to speak, there were four conditions that had to be true. Number one was the way contracts were written to provide a revenue certainty for those infrastructure assets available to many different players in the market to access. Number two was sponsorship across government, industry, local jurisdictions, both state and federally, as well as private sector and government finance that was made available. And importantly, Jess Shaw, who I see in the chat today, made a really good point to me last year, and it stuck with me that the state really did build the pipeline that allowed for that economic driver for this country to exist today. And on top of that, the market was rising, and we did find really good ways to be able to capture them, the value from them. And those economic engines still continue to drive prosperity in the country. So I suppose the question becomes, do we think the next industries will get similar forms of support? Maybe, maybe not. And really, it's our job as people working in these industries and interested in these industries to think about the fact that the 20-year contracts may not exist. Sponsorships in the way we've had in the past may not be available. The state might not choose to build or be able to build the pipeline we might have in the past. And markets are much more volatile and interconnected today than they were back when we went about building what is now a foundation for WS economy. And so let me reframe the question a bit because I think we often get this wrong. The question really isn't whether to make things like green iron or to refine critical minerals in Western Australia and or in Australia. It's whether we can make them bankable given the circumstances that we have in front of us. Hello, Sharon. Perfect timing. Um, and the one of the core tenets we find often with finance professionals is we know the cost of finance is a key issue, i.e., what is the cost of borrowing that allows for major projects like these to be made possible. And there's a huge untapped value that collectively I think we can assemble a lot more together to take the bankability problem as well as the cost of capital problem and be able to use the way we think about risk to blend them together in order to supply the value, not in the form of a slogan, but in the form of real world cases that we can stitch together these different revenue and cost stacks. So yeah, the question becomes if the cost of capital is the destiny for assets that are capital intensive and need to be around for 40, 50, 60 years, you can have two projects with the same identical engineering. Um, However, the operating costs, the land costs, investment choices depend on financing terms. As an example, when we think about green hydrogen, plainly, moving the cost of capital alone can help make it almost half the cost it is today because of how risk is attributed into the construction of these projects. So the right structuring, what it does really is bend one number down, such and hold that thought for a second, because what it allows us to do is bend the other's numbers out the other way. It's a bit nebulous, so I'll delve into what do I mean by that. So not everything, firstly, will need to think about structuring in this way. When there are some forms of assets that need to think about scarce capital available to us, and some things that are of strategic value in states like WA that we need to think about differently. So if we were to plot solar PV on this 2x2 axis over here, for all of those loving a matrix, the ability to fund it is quite high. And given where costs are today, our ability to fund it is quite easy to access as well. A bit similar for batteries, a bit different for transmission, a bit different critical minerals, a bit different green iron, and hydrogen falls in roughly that bucket. And here's the important nuance about that new form of capital demand that's in front of us. The energy pull from new industries, as well as emerging industries and data centers type of demand centers, is real. And we need to think about how does it all fit in together and weight it together carefully because capital markets are attracted towards where they can make the most money most immediately. And one of the things we are keen to think through more intensively, especially in ADL when we do what we do, is what does it mean for the different regions that we operate in? Because you put a smelter in a particular region and it directly and indirectly is able to have a gravitational impact on the communities around it. So these assets matter quite a fair bit, but importantly, what matters is the communities that are uplifted or impacted or evolved as a product of these choices that we make through energy, resources, and metals projects. And I guess this is where a question starts coming through of what are the different menu of options in front of us to think about this? There are many, and I'll talk about them in a bit of detail in a second. And it all attaches itself to what kind of risk we're trying to attach. And I'll talk about six things. Number one, if we know that there is a risk embedded in offtakes or in revenue, i.e., can someone pay for what we have to make? The kind of instruments we have available to us vary from credits, tax credits, and fractional offtakes all the way to price floors. When we talk about first-of-a-kind technologies like ammonia, green hydrogen, etc., the ability for us to concessionally finance them and or provide first-loss capital is very useful. When we talk about large, complex constructions, government-backed guarantees can be helpful to reduce construction costs. when we think about a large amount of market risk, providing some shielding against those different markets or commodity markets or energy market volatilities through different forms of government backing can be a very impactful way for us to create the revenue curvature that a bank can look at and feel comfortable giving the money for a project. Then importantly, in a lot of these large and complex projects, we'll find ourselves talking about enabling infrastructure and the ability for us to pull together this complex set of infrastructure in a way where instead of everyone having to build their own thing, we can create a common denominator set in the form of water or transmission or tenements or airports that multiple users are able to use and create an efficient environment for capital to be deployed. And lastly, but not leastly, depending upon the risk embedded in different forms of offtakes or construction or infrastructure, who's the backing counterparty is a core driver in the assessment of credit risk. And that assessment of credit risk ultimately turns into the rate at which banks can borrow, or at a rate at which equity investors feel comfortable taking equity positions to long-term hold different assets or short-term hold different assets. And there are very clever ways, and we'll talk about them a bit in a second, around how governments can provide guarantees or insurances in order to assemble all of those instruments and take the risk away and allow the market to have training wheels to stand on, and eventually when they can, take them away and they can go off running their own race. So I'll show in a second how the same menu can be assembled in two separate ways. In a case study of iron ore, WA currently ships steel, and the value is in the metal. So if we think about raw iron ore today and what it's sold at, which is give or take US $100 a ton, what we're leaving behind is a fair bit of value that our consumers for iron ore could also add on to it. When we talk about green iron, and in this particular example, I talk about HBI-based processes, the ore cost is one cost, but to produce the end product, we need to spend, the market price will be about 550 tons per ton. And that's a product of the amount of energy required to make things like green iron and the premium attached with being able to sell for that in upcoming automotive industries and other metals industries that are consuming for this. And I guess the point there being there's about 5 times more value to be made from hot briquetted iron, which is illustratively a lot of uplift that we can start to think about adding to the ore we make today into the markets of tomorrow. So in the case of green iron, 4 major risks block the capital from deployed, and we're speaking somewhat from personal experience here. And number one is the thinness of the premiums that is available in the market, i.e. the offtake risk. Number two is the quantum of energy required in order to build these things and at the right price. Hydrogen, for instance, at the moment is about 2 to 3 times more expensive than where it has to be for us to be able to produce the metal at the cost we need to in order to rationalize our margins. And then the question around if we were to make HBI, do we use a fluidized best? Do we use a DER technology? Do we wait until new chemistries become available? Is something banks look at and often find themselves asking, if we invest today, what are the chances we're investing in the wrong horse? And that unknown factor is something you can't really wish away. So the question we often find ourselves working on with investors and miners is, what are the no regrets pathways we can create for different technologies to structure the offtake and power and the capital pools in a way where if we want to pivot from one way to the other, we're able to do so in a flexible and adaptable way. So then if we talk through green steel costs and how they're structured today, green iron already is a bit hard, and it's worthwhile not pretending otherwise. But the cost of making liquid steel is very different based on different technologies. Traditional blast furnaces route are cheapest today, and scrap-based steel is also very cheap. There are projects in WA and in Queensland that are endeavoring to do that. And we are part of those projects as well. And Sharon, who's here, also has first-hand experience with some of these projects, and we can talk about that a bit more later. The cost for those two comes out roughly equally. And then when we talk about gas-based DRI and EAF processes, there is a bit of a premium on those transition pathways for gas-driven pathways. When we start talking then about pure hydrogen-driven DRI processes, they are quite expensive, in part because the electricity cost required to create hydrogen is expensive, but then also water costs and associated conversion costs. And then if you think about doing it at scale, the kind of number we will have to hit in order to be able to sell to the markets we want to is about 510 compared to where it's at today. So the point there being, we can't be expecting investors to writing blank checks for taking on these forms of technology risks. So what we do need to think about is how might we stack these different forms of technologies with no regrets pathways, anticipating the EU's emission scheme, the Chinese regulation coming in that will ask for these new products to be put in place. And this is where the role of finance really becomes interesting, in that the different instruments available to us can help reduce the cost of finance from about, give or take, 13% today to about 8% if we do a few things, and I'll talk about them in a sec. And to be clear here, when we say 13 and 8, we are not talking about borrowing costs, we're talking about the weighted average cost of capital, which is the blending of a few different things. So what are those instruments we could use to take the waterfall approach towards going from 13 to 8? Having off-taker equity and dedicated green iron funds can help shave off about 2 percentage points. Having a common user shared infrastructure financing platform can help shave off another percentage or percentage and a half. First loss and or debt facilities that are more competitive and or different tenured to concessional debt can help shave off another percentage point. And if we then find ways for ourselves to cover away the contingency risk required in construction projects, that's another percentage and a half. And I guess the underlying point here is no one lever is enough. And so the creativity required for us to navigate offtake, consumer pathways, shared infrastructure pathways, concessional debt, as well as contingency management, really do need to be accelerated in how we blend them together to take what is otherwise an unfinanceable project, really, to something that becomes a bit more competitive. And there are examples of this being successfully done. E.g., the Stegra project in Sweden assembled exactly this form of capital, which was a mix of senior debt from the government, a combination of mezzanine debt, and a ratcheted up equity pool that allowed them to make the buyers become the owners. So Mercedes, Scania, BMW took equity into Stegra itself, not just as deal off paper, but as an investor in the product that they were ultimately going to consume. Further to that, ECA covered equipment debt costs, and Euler Homes were able to cover senior debt tranches, which were then able to reduce the cost of debt. And combine the two of them together, you end up with then the ability to use concessional first loss debt products from different government or government-backed lenders to really drive the cost of capital down. Likewise, in critical minerals, today there is a very different form of risk to think about. China refines roughly 90% of rare earths today. So China does set the price. And the question then becomes, the risk is the price of this commodity that we're operating in. And they can flood things like neodymium and reduce the price artificially. And so in that particular context, it isn't technology that's the problem, but the structure of the market itself. So the question becomes, if we do want to create a competitive critical minerals pool for ourselves with all the abundant resources we have in Australia, the way to think about it needs to be quite different to how we think about ammonia or hydrogen or green steel. And I guess that's where the question around setting different ways to use price floors from entities like Export Finance Australia comes in, who can write derivative contracts for us to provide those price floors. What does that mean? If today, without a floor price in place, the market swings between $55 to $185 for neodymium. It makes it very hard for banks to know what their revenue forecast will be for a particular project. And if the revenue is going to be a bit volatile, they don't know how comfortably they'll be able to recoup the debt payments. So if that's the case, then what if we instead provide a artificial revenue floor at, for argument's sake, $110 a kilo, and say to the debt structure, if the price goes below an agreed upon threshold, we will cover your variable cost for a period of time, and you're able to, as a project, continue to operate without being fully exposed to those market pressures. So that allows us to create a more healthier and stable way to hit the break even required for projects like the neodymium project I'm talking about, for which they need about $80 a kilo of long-term price. And that allows us to shield the project if it is of strategic importance from prices that countries like China can push all the way down to about $60. And again, there are examples of Australian government and USA government doing things like this. The Iluka deal, which some of you might know about, already attempted to do things like this through stockpiling instruments. And then the MP materials deal that the US government did last year was again an example of similar structures that they were able to undertake. So both of these examples do prove that these concepts are things that people have been starting to test. And the question I think it's worth asking is, can we do it more? And should we do it more? And under what circumstances? So the insight there for us is the same menu can be applied across different stacks. And the position of the particular commodity, the position of the particular instrument, the position of the particular mineral we're trying to process in which country determined by determines what kind of instruments we should be using. So if we, for example, use this simple way to think about a revenue versus technology risk matrix, solar falls usually comfortably in the commercial debt platform. Critical minerals fall in the offtake and price floor quadrant. And things like green iron, which require a lot of money and a lot of complex kind of money, probably require a lot of different forms of support available to this. And I guess these aren't, again, to reiterate, hypothetical deals even in Australia. Australian government, for what it's worth, has a lot of really sophisticated special investment vehicles available, and as well as institutions that we have been running for many years. Snowy Hydro 2.0, its construction risk aside, is an example of how government-owned enterprises can do clever things like this and be genuinely market-shaping in nature. Likewise, the Revarying Donation Fund that the Clean Energy Finance Corporation has in place provides much cheaper and longer-tenor debt for transmission projects and has been very instrumental in uptaking projects that otherwise would have been tricky to finance. Project Energy Connect and its transmission being a good example, as well as Mariners Link, which was also funded through the CEFC debt and equity combination. So between instruments available between Export Finance Australia, CEFC, NRF, and the government's Future Made in Australia mandate, we already have things like the Critical Minerals Facility in place, the Hydrogen Production Tax Incentive, the Critical Minerals Tax Incentive. That are examples of how the government is and private sector is collaborating already to bring together these innovative instruments together and assemble them the right way. So given how many resources we do have at our disposal, which are complicated and tricky, I do think that the game in this particular context, now I'm being a bit specious here, given we're talking to Curtin University, it's our game to lose in WA. And the industrial base is there. We have the resource, we have the renewables endowment, and critically, we sit at the bottom of global cost curves for production of iron ore and other rare earths. We have the people available to us, we have the ports available to us, and we have currently, and Sharon will talk about this a bit more, the know-how of doing these hard things. So if we think about running an iron ore model that may or may not be running down, WA and Australia at large do have structural advantages that don't just disappear. We can evolve them into new products. And if today WA sits about $25 a ton in production cost, I didn't put purposely names of countries there because it's going to be complicated. We need to remember this is the bar most of the world currently has to close. So in the way we've currently got the energy prices and the current economies of scale on all the infrastructure available to us and all the people available to us, we are quite competitive. So if we lose in being competitive into the future, it'll be because we didn't make the right choices today. And we have a good example of how in Australia we've done this in the last decade. So renewables in Australia didn't just happen, we shaped that industry. In 2001, renewables were about 8% of the cumulative generation, and they're closer to about 40% today. How did that happen? How did we take the costs of solar that's fallen about 85% since 2001? We stimulated demand, we created new markets, we created incentives. And if I plot them together a little bit, just to show the journey we had to go through, in 2001, we had the renewable energy targets in place and large-scale generation certificates as a way to A, set a policy target, and B, create a revenue for people to start building renewable projects. In 2009, we added to the revenue pool in the form of feed-in tariffs that incentivized the uptake of rooftop and industrial scale solar. In 2013, CEFC was founded, and in 2016, Oliver Yates and his colleagues, including in the ACT government, Sharan can again talk about this a bit more, ran a bunch of reverse auctions to really stimulate that demand and create a cost base, an industrial base, and a workforce base that is now world leading. And in 2021, we took that many steps further in the form of New South Wales long-term energy services agreements. And right now, the capacity investment scheme that's federally being run is furthering that kind of stimulation of the demand. So we didn't create the renewables industry by being passive. It required a lot of intervention over a sustained period of time in many different ways. So this really is a whole argument game, and we need all of the tools available to us in order to do to other industries what we've demonstrably done quite successfully with renewables. So the only question left in my mind is whether we now turn those industries on using all of our collective ingenuity across green iron, across critical minerals, across data centers and what have you, to go into the future with the knowledge base that we have. And this is a choice we have to make, I suppose. And I guess the leaving thought from my end is we shouldn't try to build the Northwest Shelf in the way we have today, but we have everything we need to be able to do that between the instruments, the government vehicles, the cost advantage, and the abundant energy resources. The method, for what it's worth, I think is pretty simple. You read the risk, you pick from the menu, you assemble your stack, and your job's done. And on that note, I'll pause there. And Peter, over to you.
Okay. You make it sound so simple with that last wrap-up sentence, Manik. I'm just wondering why aren't we getting all these projects out there? Thank you very much for sharing those insights. And I know this is a topic very dear to Sharon's heart. I think you've outlined some great steps, and I think sort of made it very practically understanding. But Sharon, I might ask you to respond from your perspective, and what you're seeing. My thoughts. We'll get into that in a little bit. But this idea it's WA's opportunity to lose almost or challenge, and I think that's the thing that sort of I'm most interested. How do we not lose, and how do we stay in the game? Sharon, over to you. Yeah.
So first of all, brilliant scope, Manik, and there's no doubt that it is ours to lose. We have a risk-averse business culture. We said this last week at a discussion in Perth, and that brings with it risk-aversity in terms of financing and the confidence to actually get us from the planning through to the financing, through to the implementation, and of course, reaping the benefits. But we need to turn that around, and you can see some good success stories. You actually referred to some of them. There are a myriad of financing opportunities. I'm not going to canvass those, But I think, Peter, if you start with the plan, and for me, everything is place-based. You have to have an ambition that you want to move our country to sustainability and resilience. So yes, you need abundant clean energy. You need the reality that our industries will be based on clean energy and clean technologies. And we need to be able to support that in order to build that resilience with two fundamental things. One is affordable energy and affordable finance. And the other one is, in fact, the offtake that guarantees that production is going to be actually part of a demand and supply environment. It does require us to rethink some of our trade parameters, because if you just think we'll make this and the demand will be there, that's not necessarily the case in a volatile world with all of the geopolitics of markets being disrupted everywhere. But we can pivot on that and say, who wants our clean iron, our clean steel? Well, our Asian neighbours do. You know, Korea and Western Australia have an absolute capacity to actually develop a joint venture approach that would be backed in by many of the instruments that Manik talked about. And it is a stack, it's a portfolio of approaches. But if you have affordable finance, and the question is, how do you best deliver that? And indeed, you have offtake. And we're not talking about 1 or 2 years, we're talking about 20 years. These are not new concepts. If you actually go back in history, not that long ago, we used to have the Australian Wheat Board, and it bought all the wheat. And then it sold it when, in fact, the market demand was there and the price was acceptable. So in that context, governments aren't risking anything to actually look at what is the capacity for joint ventures, for government offtake, for other areas that give certainty, that allow then finance markets to play into the mix. In the hard to establish areas, and Manik's named a number of them, then you do need to say, how do we share that risk across a number of entities? I'm not going to go over the things he said. Suffice to say that, you know, it was 2017, after we had achieved just transition in the Paris Climate Agreement, and we were looking for demonstration projects while you dealt with the transition areas that were much more difficult, like transitioning away from fossil fuels, which actually, particularly with coal, as we began, you needed the committees, the commissions, the joint discussions, the plan, and that took a number of years in the making. But we actually worked with Sweden and SSAB Steel to show, with the union collaboration and indeed the industry, that you could transition to green steel using green hydrogen. It showed Europe it could be done. One of the biggest problems that dogged the pricing output there and dogs us today is fossil fuel subsidies. So when people talk about green premium, they're forgetting there's a fossil fuel discount over here because the fossil fuel subsidies are still there. So how do you actually equalise the incentive? How do you motivate companies that have the capital, that have the technology, that have the skills to actually transition? Well, use it or lose it, equalise the incentives, and then it's either put to use in terms of the rapid industrial transition we have to make, or it's lost, because this is taxpayers' money. So there are those other areas where governments can intervene on tax, whether it's, regional development zones that have a deferred tax capacity, or whether it's, in fact, tax credits for certain industries, whatever it might be. But you look at what the available instruments are, just as Manik said, but get the plan that enables you then to do the financial analysis that says, what do we need to fund? And I'll finish on this note by saying one of the things that I heard Manik refer to is a passion for you and I, Peter, which is common use infrastructure. We've got to build more in the next 10 years than we've built in the last 100. If you take the energy infrastructure, the industrial transitions, the pivoting in terms of trade and development, upstream and downstream provision, then if we really want to develop our regions, if we really want to shift our urban base in terms of energy, then common use infrastructure has to actually enable us to do that. It can be pre-competitive, of course, but it not just serves industry, it actually serves, and their supply chains, it serves communities as well. And you get a holistic approach to development. If you're looking at WA and you look at Collie, fantastic 10-year plan, absolutely. But even though they planned the land and the incentives for attracting the new industries, we didn't plan the finance early enough. And so it's been a hurdle to get to finance and indeed offtake. Getting there, but these things have to all be in the mix with the community, with the unions right from the beginning, so people have a transparency about what an integrated plan for the region looks like in the context of a global and national industrial transition, and how you put all the integrated economic planning, including financing, together so that there are actually new ventures emerging as we close fossil fuel industries. So let's have some questions and see where we go. But I have no doubt Australia has the capital, we have the know-how, we have the trade partnerships. We just need to get better at integrated planning.
So I'm just going to jump in because, I mean, both of you make it sound so easy, right? Need a plan. It's nothing new. We've just got to take the risk and structure it. But in my observation, it's not really happening. I mean, we've argued about pay space. So I guess from your, and even Stegra, like when I was up there talking, they said if we tried to do this now, it wouldn't get up. So how do we cut through these issues around, that creating the certainty, and why is it, Manik, that it's so hard to get it to that next thing? If we look at FMIA, there's been funds and they've changed and they've moved. We haven't been able to deliver it. So what's the problem, and what do we need to get over that, do you think? I mean, you've structured the plans, but what's going to keep Australia competitive?
It's a really good question. Again, I should start by saying at the moment, Australia is a world-leading cost-competitive iron ore producer. We have the most abundant bauxite resources attached to aluminium anywhere in the world, right? We're the second largest exporter of aluminium. Nickel is a good example of how is it that where we go from abundance in resources and Nickel West as a world-leading resource to asking ourselves the doldrums the market needed to shut down temporarily. These are problems we're facing right now. And speaking from current life experience, just being careful with what I should say here. Some of the people in the chat already know this. The quantum of capital required to do this is quite high, and it can be daunting to see numbers like $130 billion of total infrastructure required to build energy, transmission, water, tenements, and then technology aspects of it. So I think part of it is the psychological challenge that is attached to doing these things at scale. And one of the things I think we need to collectively do more of is chunk it down, because the elephant as a whole is hard to consume. And if it seems too hard, then there is a psychological impact of that on policymakers, on government, on commercial people as well. Of if it seems too hard, no one's going to go for it. So I think part of a core instrument is to chunk down the elephant in bite-sized pieces, which kind of leads to the second point of once we can chunk it down into those bite-sized pieces. This is where I talk about matching risk to the right type of menu. Different risks require different kind of management. And I think the efficient tax economists up in different forms of government potentially think about industry policy too efficiently and not commercially enough. So if we firstly take these complex capital major project problems, and they're not market problems, right? They are major capital projects. A major capital project is not a market maker, so to speak. It is a big hunky thing we have to deliver. So you kind of go, okay, firstly, we need to build this big behemoth of a thing. We have to build foundations for it. Some of it we maybe need to build ourselves. Some of it, what if we shared the cost through and for the ecosystem reduce the cost down? And that is not an efficient tax problem. That's just a capital project management problem. So firstly, that psychological shift of going, these are not abstract problems, these are physical delivery problems, will help quite a fair bit. Because when we do that, then getting into conversation around, okay, now when we want to deliver transmission, we now know it's a project and project risk. Now we want to deliver energy generation. Now we know it's a project and project risk. Now we want to deliver a mine. We know it's a chicken and egg problem, but it's a solvable one because at least 2 of the 5 elements now are knowable. So I think if I was to say what is the Occam's razor way to think about it, I'd say we kind of have to pick a couple of winners and then aggressively treat them as capital projects rather than these efficient market hypothecations that can be too efficiently often approached in the solutions we deploy at them.
But Peter, also, if you look at chunking it down, let's take ammonia. You know, we've seen with the geopolitical environment that what's at risk here, diesel, fuel, and the engines, if you like, for everything from sustainable food or food security and sustainable agriculture through to, you know, the fuel mix on farms, but also in some of our transport sectors. If you actually look at the production of ammonia, particularly given what Manik said, that we went from 8% solar now to, you know, depending on which state, but sort of as a nation, more than 40%. And you say, well, how do you actually look at where those sources of clean energy can support the production of hydrogen and therefore ammonia, which can be used for fertilizer, for fuel, and so and many other applications? Then that's a dedicated industry planning piece that's vital now, builds resilience, grows new industries, and is not that expensive to support. So if you look at ClimateWorks' Luto 2 model, and it's now having the capacity to look at renewable energy in it, and you actually analyse region by region where you would do this, then you can have that industry up and running very quickly. But it will just take that dedicated planning for something that is, in fact, a national emergency. And then if you go to looking at where we've already built out renewables, the surprise for everybody is that the battery capacity that's been put into houses, not just the amount of batteries, but the capacity of household batteries are probably 6, 7, 8 times what's necessary to manage the household storage required for downtimes. And that's being used in places like California now in virtual power stations to support the clean energy solutions that indeed data centres and their companies are being forced to purchase by bringing their own clean energy solutions. They're actually keeping the pressure off the grid, making a return into households who are already invested in energy storage that they don't need, and everybody wins. So again, sitting down and looking at creative solutions where we can expand the capacity we've already built, even before we get to how we have to build out those massive areas, and it's not an either or, then we can give people confidence that we can build a resilience from the ground up.
We might go to questions just because we're going to run out of time, but obviously in amongst that is the leadership that's required to create the plans, right? And also, Manik, as you say, back a couple of winners, and who decides that somehow I think is also really a challenging thing. But it maybe goes to Nicole, which is sort of comment question. She asked, it would be great if Manik could share his views on cross-border partnership financing with governments as contributors. Is it realistic as an option, Manik? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, firstly, great question. I think the short answer is yes. And Export Finance Australia, for what it's worth, are very clever, very collaborative, very open, and they welcome these opportunities. The critical minerals facility that Export Finance Australia have set up last year is innovative. It's using a mixture of very different insurance products together. It's treating a physical delivery risk as a financial risk, which allows us to be much more nimble. And they're doing that in partnership with US Exim, if not directly in investment, at least in policy alignment. And then to the question of could we do this with our trade partners in Japan and Korea, a lot of us would know JPEG are very excited to participate in Australia. Companies like Sumitomo, Marubeni, POSCO, they are quite active in Australia, and they partner with their equivalents of Export Finance Australia and EXIMs all the time. There are many projects I'm working on where we are having those live discussions on blending a Korean Development Bank backed deal along with different forms of Australian capital. There are things Sharan is across where we're looking at similar things with other jurisdictions like Singapore and Hong Kong also. So the answer is we can do those. We are doing those. The challenge often does come down to the quantum of support required, which can be quite hard. And that's partly where the common user infrastructure instrument is very useful, because it takes out an inflated cost stack, which otherwise makes these things very hard to finance. So it's almost around kind of going, if the cost is artificial and the banks are there, they want to support cross-jurisdictionally, and they continue to say, it's just too hard. What can we do to take that risk away? And duplicating effort and infrastructure investment is one of the barriers where these things often get stuck at.
Manik's right about that, but it's also that, there will be projects you fund project by project, no doubt about that. And some of them will be groundbreaking, some of them will be just additional value add. But if you take an industry or a place-based approach and you build an asset investment platform, then there's a confidence in investing in the development of a sector or a place, because the ambition and the outcome is there. And particularly in regard to cross-jurisdictional pieces, where you've got Korean companies, for example, working with Australian companies, and Peter, because you and I have had discussions with the Mission Possible partnerships, coordination with Rachel and others, that this is an aim that is possible to deliver. Now, yes, we need some, government certainty and support. But again, Manik's right. We have the infrastructure for export support, for advice and so on in both countries, bringing them together and saying, what's the model where both companies win? And by the way, what finance can you bring from your backers in Korea and we bring from our backers in Australia, and putting it together absolutely builds a confidence. And it doesn't have to be just one one part of an industry. Can be a sector, can be a place, can be, an ambition to simply scale up what's already on track.
Yeah. I'm going to go, I might note right now too, Common User Infrastructure, the Pilbara Industry Summit has been on for the last 2 days. I didn't go this year because for several reasons, but, I think in that there's a place where Common User Infrastructure, aka transmission, has been on the agenda since I arrived in WA, I think, Sharan, but we have yet to see that deployment except through private place. And so there's an interesting conundrum, I think, in why is that? We haven't touched on First Nations today, but I'm going to go back to one of the first questions because this was put in early. So, Manik, it would be interesting, and I think it builds on things you said. If you were the WA Treasurer, what are the 3 things you would implement now that will drive our investment to support this transition? What are the 3 things? You've given us lists. What would you do today? Because even the industries referred to are still emitting large amounts of CO2, which is our big challenge, Sharan, right?
Yeah. It's a really fascinating question. And thank you for asking that. I'll answer in 2 flavors. One is, if I was a treasurer, what I would do, and the flavor 2 is more relevant to this chat. If I was the treasurer today and I had the iron ore riches that I have and the oil and gas riches that I have, I would be building a lot more schools and hospitals. But that's where I say, if the question is what would I do, it would be very different. It's kind of self-serving, but also human capital is not to be undervalued, right? We have such an abundant resource of people in the country, and I see Kate George is in the meeting as well, and people like Kate, if we clone them, I think we'll live in a much different country. Uh, so the investment in education and using our resource riches at the right time, I think is undervalued, to say the very least. If we are to avoid the Dutch disease, which is really where we're headed at the moment, uh, like we need to think about that stuff. But then if I zoom into, I guess, the infrastructure component of it, one of the conversations I'm often being asked by colleagues and partners in China and India we work with in steel in particular is, where's Australia's 5-year plan? And, and is there an equivalent thing? So the reason I bring it up is the coordination piece in the federal and state jurisdiction is obviously challenging, and there's different mandates, there's different power structures, which Sharon understands better than I do. If we are to help bring discipline to capital allocation, we do need to think about capital discipline in its design as well. So if I was the treasurer and I was to be doing what we need to do, whilst we have to let the big miners determine their own fate, if we create the ingredients for them to be cost competitive in a sustainable way, of course they'll stay here. So I think that planning piece is undervalued in a proactive way rather than a passive planning way where we kind of get led by the miners as opposed to proactively creating the ingredients for creating those competitive cost bases.
I'm just really aware of time, so I might just jump to another question, and then, I mean, literally that's 2 o'clock, so we have to let everybody go. But this was sort of came late responding. Government's not willing to take a build it and they will come approach to common user infrastructure. So how can we develop a model that will cut through that? You know, and it says here, through the chicken and egg issue of government wanting project proponents close to FID before committing and proponents needing certainty around the infrastructure to get their projects right.
Yeah. Can maybe Sharon, you can take that one, given your many decades of experience doing this.
Well, I think, again, the risk-averse nature of getting projects to FID is really frustrating. There's no doubt about that. But I think we're going to see a shift. I do think you'll see a shift. You'll see us crack offshore wind in Victoria this year, hopefully up through the East Coast into New South Wales. But that's going to be a big investment. But it's not just an investment in a big piece of infrastructure. It actually, if you think about it, Peter, on our passion for decommissioning, and think about it in Victoria, you need the same infrastructure. You need ports, you need renewable energy, you need skills. And Manik's right about investing in human capital. You put those things together, you can get offshore wind and the supply chains that make it possible with all of the various onshore transitions in marine craft, in small fabrication that is possible now in local content, even as we build up our capacity. You get all of that vibrancy in a community that generates an economic confidence, but you get the same infrastructure to actually have, I don't know, what is it, a 30% slice of decommissioning in a $60 billion industry in Victoria. And then you go to WA and you look at the same opportunities. So it's about saying, if we want to invest in this project, what's the infrastructure need? Who contributes to it? What is, whether it's, partly government, whether it's a tax incentive. If you look at what those large companies are spending on their own infrastructure now, how do you incentivise them to share it and actually reap a return from everybody benefiting from, financial instruments, whether it's ownership, leasing arrangements, part subsidies, tax benefits, put it all together in the stack that Manik talks about, and we get the infrastructure we need for a variety of projects. So I'm convinced it's possible. You ran the workshop on decommissioning. We're hopefully going to have another one in Victoria. But let's this time look at not just the ports infrastructure required plus energy and skills. Let's also look at what other projects could share in that development. and where you brought up the financial capacity risk.
Yeah. All right. I'm aware of the time. I think Sharon's he just wavered for a minute there. I think once again, what this is showing me, there's so much to discuss on this topic. You know, Manik, you've got the solutions, but I would suggest we probably don't have the plan, we don't have the structuring, and yet it's all there, the plate, the leadership and so forth. And I think we've got a coalition of the willing, as we saw last time. So I am thinking how we might sort of build on this to actually continue that conversation. I think there's real appetite and some good people to partner to perhaps do that. I'm sorry to the people we didn't get to answer the question. I think it just shows, you know, people are very interested to engage and think about what we could do and what needs to happen. But just wanted to say thank you very much both to you, Manik and Sharon, for joining. We are running some webinar series coming soon on decarbonising heavy industry, building on this, Manik, around having a presentation from Heidelberg Materials, Yarra Pilbara and others as well. But, you know, can I just say on behalf of everybody, there's a real interest in this, a real appetite. So to have both of you share your time and your expertise gives me a little bit of hope that we will get there and that we will keep winning, because I think we are at a precipice right now, and it's too important not to grab onto the opportunity. So thank you very much, and thanks everyone for joining, and obviously we'll hopefully post this up so others can access, but thanks.